Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Indeed, it is showtime. Welcome in. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford, and lots to talk about this week, and there are some really important issues that we want to deal with right off the top, so let's get around the table fast here. John Wright is here. He's our veteran pollster and founder, co-host here at On the Ledge. Keith Leslie, longtime Queen's Park observer at CHTV, former Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, and former leader of the PC Party. And the only reason he's not the former premier is because of Kathleen Wynne.
You're rubbing that in, Dave. That's how we're going to start the show.
Just saying, just to kind of add to the spice of the program. Currently the partner at Council Public Affairs and former leader of the PC Party of Ontario. Okay, important things first. Yes, this is ugly shirt season, so it's just part of the collection. If you're watching on YouTube, you will appreciate it. And we need to close the chapter now. So this past week, beautiful day, Monday here in Toronto. You're at Rob Ford Stadium. Tim, I know Deb took the day off radio to be there as well. It was a big day. Yeah.
So Maitland was in two events, long jump and 4x100 at the Toronto Catholic District School Board City Track Championships. And so she's no training in this area. So Maitland had won her local competition, advanced, and some really, really strong girls in this competition. So in the first round, Maitland was fourth. Not bad, right? Not bad in the jump, but quite a distance. Took her second jump, remained in fourth place. And she had jumped about 3.67 meters. Dad, remember these things? The first and second were just over 4 meters. And then there's a third. And then Dave on the last jump, and she's like the second last jumper. So everybody else is finished except one behind her. First and second place in considerable distance ahead of her. And she just screwed up this determination, this courage. You can see the fire in her eyes. I'm right there filming it, right? As a dad would right by the sand pit. And then she leaps and she jumped the farthest that she's ever jumped before, 40 additional centimeters to come in at 4.08 and to win the gold medal of the TCDSB championships.
Wow.
It was awesome. And it was cool too, because she got to go on the podium, right? Just like the Olympics. There's got to be a couple thousand kids, parents, and teachers there in the audience. And it was early in the track meet. They do the long jump early, so they're playing the national anthem. They're, in my memory, forever, and Deb's for sure, but I bet you that's going to be something that will be a great life lesson for Maitland and a memory she'll always treasure.
Yeah.
And how fast is your heart beating, Dad?
Yeah, really. Dad's doing this, and she's going over through the air. She's pumping. He's pumping along with her.
The Chariots of Fire music came on, and it's a motion leap. And then her 4x100. So these girls, 11 years old, they won the silver as well. And they had come second in the regionals. They beat the team that beat them and came in a very solid second place. So she walked away with a gold and silver medal at Rob Ford Stadium for the biggest city in the entire country. I'm wicked proud.
Yeah, well done. And as you should be. That's good. That's just good fun. And we were just saying before we came on the air, the value of that experience in an educational setting is, well, I don't think you can put a value on it, right? That the lessons learned in sport, the lessons learned through arts participation, whether, I did it all when I was in high school. I did sports, I did the academics at St. Mike's, I did theater, I did music, I did all that stuff. And I'll tell you that those are the things that I remember. I sent you guys a video there the other day of one of our jam sessions. One of the guys in that video, he and I have been playing music together for 50 years. So wow. I remember that a whole lot more than I remember Father Hibbard's Latin class.
Yeah. What got you out the door in the morning, right? Was it track practice or was it math class?
Yeah.
Sorry, track practice.
Yeah. Well, humping my hockey bag on the Wilson bus down to St. Mike's to have a preschool, practice or whatever it might have been. Those are the things you remember. So anyway, that you'll be telling that story for a long time, Tim. So, and you will enjoy it. So thanks for sharing that with us.
Well done.
Indeed. Okay, where to start? I think probably where we left off last week, and I just want to share with you guys. I got a an email, a rather lengthy email. And this is one I had to scroll down a couple times by the time I got to the bottom of it. And it's from Justina Ray. She's the president and senior scientist at the Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada. Quite pleased that we spent so much time talking about Bill 5 and giving it the attention it deserved. And then, but she did point out, but you missed this and you missed that. So I said, okay, well, listen to the show following week. This was this past week. And so she followed up and said, okay, now you got it all covered. But I think, Tim, in as much as this is passed, the bill has passed, that in general, I think your mantra has been, we got to get shit done. We got to get this thing moving forward. And we will deal with this as we work through the process. I think it's going to be hard to diminish the reaction of the Chiefs. I mean, Alvin Fiddler talking about it at Queen's Park, calling the Premier a coward for a variety of reasons because he missed the boat. I'm not sure that was good optics, but I just don't think that they're going to be able to make this go away with any kind of salve over the summer. So I appreciate the fact that we need to move forward on this, but boy, it seems to be a treacherous path between now and Labor Day.
Yeah, look, I know I'm an outlier on this. It just strikes me as so much hyperbole on the other side. This notion there's no environmental rules, not true. Sections 10 and 12 deal with environmental rules. There's more enforcement ability. There's support funds for it. Greater ability of officers to crack down on those who break the rules around species. We have constitutional rights defined strongly by courts around Indigenous participation, anything that impacts on their territory. So I just feel that it's gone so far that I'm going to call it out. We'll see who's right or not. It is enabling legislation. So, more of the proof will come in what kind of regulations come forward that govern this process. But the bigger picture thing for me, I'll be quick on the 3 points. Number one, the Ford government tends not to when it comes to major policy shifts, they tend to find a reasonable middle. They're actually not that aggressive compared to, say, the Mike Harris government I was part of, the John Chrétien government nationally. They tend to look for compromise. Number two, you do need some tension in the system. Surely to goodness, we want mineral development in Canada and North America, not seeing dollars go to China. It takes 10 to 15 years to build a mine. So you need to actually say, we got to try something better than this. And third and finally, why it's hyperbole? The bill that David Eby, the Premier of British Columbia, has brought forward, very, very similar to Doug Ford. I think Prime Minister Carney is going to be in a similar ballpark on programs of national interest. You don't see anywhere near the same volume there. I suspect it's because it's a Conservative government bringing forward, not an NDP or Liberal, doing pretty much the same thing.
Well, part of that could also be the relationship that the province and the Crown have with the First Nations in British Columbia is different than it is in Ontario. It's unceded territory. I mean, we're getting way down in the weeds on that, but that relationship changes it. And I remember talking to folks in the forestry sector about that and how that changed the conversation around resource development in British Columbia, just because there is a sovereign approach to the First Nations in BC. So it's the relationship thing. I get it. And not to get too far down on the weeds, as I said on that, but part of the delays, Kathleen, and we always want to look at regulations, say the regulation's the problem, But, Justina Ray, in her note to us, pointed out that oftentimes it's financing. It's other business-related things that get in the way. How do we make sure that there's certainty and investments and all those sorts of things are taken into account? And that's not really a government problem. It's something that you can legislate one way or the other. So there are a lot of worms in this can. And then to complicate matters, I think, the Premier this week suggested that the duty of consultation was taking too long, that in fact it was slowing things down. So there's so many things in here, not just regulation, that are extending that period of time before you can get drills in the ground.
Yeah, well, and I think Tim and Keith will remember when we were going into the Ring of Fire, when Dalton was the Premier and we were going into the Ring of Fire conversations and Rick Bartolucci was the minister, and we were talking about having a ferrochrome plant in Sudbury, and there were all sorts of decisions being made, and then the commodity price went down, and so the investments were not there. But look, I really think that in this instance, the relationship, Dave, you start talking about relationships, the relationship work was not done before this bill was drafted and brought into the legislature. I think that was a big mistake. Now, my personal perspective is that this government, when they came in 2018, they did not start doing the work to build relationships with any of the Indigenous people and leadership in the province. And so this is kind of the fruit of that. But I think with this particular piece of legislation, had the work been done, it could have turned out very differently. I think given the pushback that was the result of that lack of relationship and that lack of consultation, and I don't mean empty consultation, I mean developing a real partnership on how permitting was going to be done, for example, because I know that was a huge issue with the First Nations in the and is with the First Nations in the Ring of Fire area. But given this pushback, I think if the government had made a decision, look, we're going to pull this legislation back. We're not going to push to get it through now. We're going to take the summer. It's only a couple of months. We're going to take the summer. We're going to revise it, and we're going to bring it back in the fall with more input. The trouble is now they're saying they're going to consult, and the First Nations leaders are saying, well, it's too late. You've already passed the bill. If they had not passed the bill, done some consultation over the summer, tried to repair some of the relational issues, and then brought it back in the fall. And in that time, seeing how the federal government was going to deal with these relationship issues, because look, it's not simple. And the federal government has said they are going to work with Indigenous people. So I think they've made a mistake in terms of pushing the bill through now. They could have waited until the fall, done some work over the summer, and they wouldn't be facing this really, really hostile reaction. I think we're in a very bad place in terms of the relationship between the government, the Ontario government, and First Nations governments right now.
Keith, I want to get to the federal implications of this in terms of how this is all going to be done, and not necessarily in lockstep, but at the same kind of timeline and in objectives. But things were complicated at the park this week when the Liberals pulled their amendment stunt. They offered up like 4,000 amendments on the bill to kind of effectively kill it in committee. And and what happened is the government was unable to actually get to its own amendments that it had promised the First Nations in terms of consultation, et cetera. So that's not included in this legislation, if I'm reading that correctly. Is that right?
Well, that's right. And the consultations didn't happen beforehand. And so what the opposition parties were trying to do was force the government not to pass it before the legislature rises today, Thursday, for the summer. They wanted to, not pass it, and to Kathleen's point, and then work on your relationship with the First Nations people, and then come back with the bill, pass it then, and then get your regulations in order. But they didn't do that. And to your point about the federal implications of this, and I want to challenge Tim a little bit on this, because I don't think it's partisan. I think it's about government-to-government relationships, and the First Nations are very angry with the Ontario government, but they're not too pleased with the federal Liberal government right now either. I mean, the new Justice Minister, Sean Fraser, made the comment about, consultation does not mean First Nations get a veto, and we want to get projects done faster. Well, he's out right away apologizing. I shouldn't have said that. Well, why not? It is the truth. I mean, the courts have ruled the consultation does not give the First Nations a veto, but he's already apologizing for that. So what I see being set up here is, the First Nations are already angry in Ontario. If they start getting angry with the federal government as well, we could be in for national protests because both governments, the federal and provincial government, are all about getting things done quicker, about bypassing a lot of regulations and consultations. Essentially, they want to, a speeded up process. And anyone who's ever dealt with any of the First Nations knows speeded up processes just don't apply. Their timelines are different. And so this is going to be very frustrating for governments, and it's going to be very frustrating for First Nations. And I see it spilling out nationally because the federal government has essentially the same idea as the Ontario government. It's a different approach, regulations and whatnot, but they both want to get projects approved and in the ground, at least, starting on these projects within 2 years. It doesn't seem that big a goal, but it is a huge goal, especially if you're talking about actually getting the consultations done that are mandated. So it's going to be a very tricky issue. And I think a lot of First Nations do firmly believe that if they don't want a pipeline crossing their territory, they have a veto over that, and they don't. So I think that's going to be a very difficult issue for all levels of government to deal with this year when they're pushing so hard to get the economic development that we need to fight the Trump tariffs, 50% on steel, for goodness. We need to get these projects going. We need to get our own economy, on track and boost it up. But I don't see it being a smooth process right now. I see a lot of court challenges and maybe the public protests that have been warned about as well. So, I mean, we've already had one First Nations woman camping out overnight at the legislature just to show her indignity, the upset, how angry the community is. And she's from, anyway, it's such a terrible issue for the government to have basically ignored this ahead of time and brought the bill in and then said, well, now we'll consult. It's just the wrong way of going about it. And they knew this going in.
I'm going to come back to you on that, Tim. Just want to get John in on this, though. And that therein lies the problem. As far as the First Nations and the Indigenous communities in this country, John, are concerned, this isn't about political stripe. It doesn't matter who sits in the legislature and rules the legislature. They are looking at it from their own perspective. And, you heard Salma Makwa get kicked out of the legislature this week for accusing the premier of lying. And when asked about it later, he said, essentially it comes down to trust. Why would I trust them, even if they said that they were going to offer up the amendments?
Well, I think you have to take the long view on this in two ways. Number one is this is the third majority government mandate of the Ford government, and it's being preceded by other governments. And I can't recall in my lifetime when there was calm in the waters between the Indigenous population and government. I just can't. And it doesn't matter what stripe. So, I mean, yes, they could have been working more to calm the waters on this, but the disparate nature of the Indigenous population and the leadership was evident in the post-pass announcements that followed. I mean, it was intransigence where three chiefs stepped up to the microphone and basically said, our creator made the land the way it is, and we want to keep it the same. So I can understand the frustration of governments moving forward, but what I hate to say this, but tactically what's missing is that there are a lot of Indigenous leaders who are in favor of development, who are actually involved in local development opportunities, and I don't see the other side of that ledger. I mean, from a public opinion point of view, they may see it as intransigence on the Indigenous side, but there are leaders who could come to the table and could deal with it. Number two, I think you have to look broadly at this bill. And yes, the government wanted to get it done, as Doug Ford talks about putting shovels in the ground. And yes, they're going to have to deal with the relationships and have consultation and maybe confrontation moving forward. But I'd also refer to it as the Shiny Object Act. I mean, we've talked a lot about what it's going to do about mining in the north, but this also has the ability to identify economic zones anywhere else on all kinds of other projects. So in a way, it is a bit of a victory for the government because they've got this through. They will have to deal with the Indigenous population and the leadership to try and smooth things over. And yeah, the federal government as well, but they were able to do it and address other potential opportunities that the government sees as going forward and get out of the house for the summer. So I agree there should have been a lot more consultation. I agree that, there should have been more Indigenous leaders at the table who were talking about the benefits of this. But I also think the government got it passed and can deal with other things other than just mines in the north.
Tim, the idea, though, that to sort of suggest that the chiefs are against the development is just not on. I mean, they're clearly saying, we want this development. We want Ring of Fire. We want the benefits that come with mining. And but what they're also saying is that their ethic is you leave the land and the community better off than you found it. Mm-hmm. So you got to balance those two things off. And so to Keith's point around what the federal government did this week, and particularly the justice minister, interesting how he was right in what he said, but nonetheless ends up stepping on a rake that he, right in front of him, hit him right between the eyes. But at the same time, it suggests to me there's a lack of understanding of the sensitivity of this particular conversation.
I just can't resist on Sean Fraser, by the way, who I worked with when he was a housing minister, but it's a bit of karma here, right? The guy said he was going to retire from politics and spend more time with his family. And then he found out he didn't really want to spend that much time with the family after a few weeks. I do think, I'll see where the premier stands in this, but I do think that if you say you're going to retire and then you change your mind, you come back, there should be at least a 20,000 vote deduction on your next election campaign. I think that would be fair. I'll propose that today.
Hello, John Tory, line 1. Okay, go ahead.
But to the seriousness of the issue, look, I'll try to dig around more because I'm reacting to this on a gut level. I admit that. I just can't countenance the notion that there was no consultation on these concepts whatsoever, right? I think Minister Rickford has done a very good job engaging with Indigenous communities on having more say on, getting more prosperity, fixing ills across reserves, particularly in Northern Ontario. Mines ministers would have been involved. Like, I just don't think there's no consultation. Granted, Bill 5 is a new entity. Bill 5 probably would not have been considered back in December, even January of this year, because we didn't have the threat of the Trump tariffs like we do today. So it accelerated the process. Look, I had the opportunity to visit the Ring of Fire. Let me think about this. I was leader then, so I'd say a decade ago. And I bet you, Dave, if I went back today, there would not be one single change in that area. You're struck by the beauty, the vastness, nothing around, the potential under the ground, but it has not moved. So I'm going to wager, call me on it 6 months down the road, it was worth the gamble to put some tension to the process, to say the current system is broken and see where that gets you. Because I think the way of doing things in the past would mean we would still talk about the same issue 10 years from now.
Yeah, go ahead.
I got to jump in, Dave.
Yeah.
So, couple of things. I need to push back on your contention that 'twas ever thus, it's all the same, and a bit what you're saying too, Tim. There are differences between the way governments interact with different populations and with different groups. So the fact is that we did have I had a different relationship than certainly the one that I see on the face of it that Doug Ford has as premier. I sat at the table with the 9 Matawa First Nations. And Tim, to your point about what's going on in the Ring of Fire, I mean, the only announcements that have been made around any progress on the Ring of Fire have been announcements around the road that 2 of the First Nations have agreed to. That was the agreement that we came to when we were in government as a result of David Zimmer and I, my minister and I, sitting with the Matawa First Nations in the Ring of Fire community. So there are differences. And to say that Minister Rickford has a good relationship with First Nations, I would need that fact checked because I'm involved in an organization in Northwestern Ontario, and I can tell you that is not what I hear on the ground. So I believe that if there had been, for example, an agreement on the permitting process that was going to be a result of Bill 5, if there had been agreement on what the framework of the resource revenue sharing deal was going to be, because resource revenue sharing is a huge issue when it comes to resource extraction, because there have been generations of First Nations not having the benefit of resources that have been taken out of their land, the land that their communities are on. So I think if those had been in place, we wouldn't be seeing this pushback that we're seeing now. So I just think we have to be careful when we say, oh, it's always been like this, it's always been hard. Well, actually, there are things that have been done and that can be done in order to make the relationship better and to be able to move more smoothly into a partnership of economic development. We just haven't experienced that before, but it doesn't mean it's not possible.
So Bill 5 is being kicked around as this thing that's being pushed through hastily, not a lot of consultation, et cetera. But also in the last week, the government stood up, and it was a matter of hours from the time the bill was tabled to the time it was passed, and it gave MPPs a raise, Keith, and it also opened up the possibility of the pension, and we'd been talking about that. I think you were banging that drum a few weeks ago, so clearly the finance minister took your comment to heart and just decided that he had good cover because you gave him blessing.
He watches.
Yeah, but he didn't listen to me when I said, don't go with the raise, just bring back the pension plan first. They did both, 35% raise. That makes for a bad headline. So that's only something that a third consecutive majority government can do in its first year and get everybody else behind them. I mean, boy, the legislature can move quick, as Martin Redcon pointed out, when it needs to. And I don't think anyone argues that, a 16-year wage freeze is a bit much for anyone to take. Not that any, people are expected to be there 16 years, but there certainly were members that, during that time. But it's the pension plan as well. I think both are well deserved. I think it's brave of the Ford government to do it, but it was smart of them to line up, and as the finance minister stood there, every opposition party is there with him. Every member saying that we need this, it has to be done. You do it in a day. I know there was more debate at Toronto City Council when they voted themselves their massive raise, but I still think that this one was better deserved, and I think Toronto City Councilors are way overpaid compared to their provincial MPPs. And I think, again, pegging it at 75% of what a federal MP makes for representing the same riding, smart politics.
Well, and I would maybe push back a little bit in terms of what the role that a municipal politician has in terms of, taking care of business in a community. It really is, I just put the garbage out, and that's where I live, right? And so the municipal folks are probably the government that I touch more closely. So whether or not I'm more involved with my MP or my MPP, I don't know. Having said that, it just seemed a little outrageous that pay raise. But Tim, I think, whether you want to say it was just good timing and they kind of dropped that one in quietly while there was all kinds of noise going on elsewhere, I don't know that you were going to get a whole lot of pushback on that from many quarters. I didn't even see a whole lot of media, complain about it.
It was a lot less than I think MPPs would have expected. I remember, man, I've been involved in that issue from the get-go when we, cut pay and got rid of the pension and replaced with a defined contribution plan and took away the non-taxable benefits, right? And then it's hard to remember exactly who did what. We did then peg it to federal salaries at one point. That was rescinded. And then it's been frozen since 2008, I believe. So and those debates in caucus, whether I was on the government side or the opposition side, there was always a concern about how people would react in the public and would you wear it. And the main thing was really an example of game theory, right? If you got behind it, but one of the opposition parties or members called you out, fat cats, all that kind of stuff, then you would retreat from trying to take that sort of blame. So they obviously lined up all the support beforehand to make sure that game theory would not play out. There was not a single member who objected and held up the process. Yes, it would have been neater if you had a blue ribbon panel that would examine this and compare to other areas and probably end up in a similar spot where you peg to the federal number. But I think the bottom line here, Dave, is sometimes you just got to win ugly. This was an ugly win, but I think it's actually good to retain and attract talent to the Ontario legislature. Well,
it might have been an ugly win, John, but the point is, can we just take that off the plate now and not, have it sort of this bitching point for every time we talk about, what's going on in the legislature? Let's just sort of set it. And if it's always compared to, this standard, it's just going to happen automatically. We don't have to leave it in the hands of the legislators anymore to give themselves a raise.
Yeah, if you can peg it to something else, obviously, it's better because then it automatically moves forward. Secondly, there were a lot of issues last time I checked going on that are a bigger distraction, whether it be Bill 5 or the tariffs or other issues. I think this was something which was put forward without just that consideration, but it managed to get through because of that. I mean, people have other concerns right now than that. I also want to know from Tim whether we have to refer to him as the Honorable Tim Hudak, because I think that was contained in that bill as well. It just kind of glided under the radar for a lot of constituencies and individuals because there were, I think, other issues that were making much bigger notoriety at the time.
Well, I think we determined that we both, Kathleen and Tim, are the honorables based on.
Well, I think he gets to keep his title now. He gets the title now.
Formerly honorable. Honorable.
No, but wasn't it included in the bill where it, in fact? Yeah. So there you go.
Yeah. So if it's formerly honorable sounds like it's almost like a
no. It was removed for a reason.
You had your epaulets taken off.
That's right. They ripped them right off there.
That's how it felt.
And we talked, about procedure and the Liberals with their 4,000 amendments to Bill 5, and I can't say that without laughing because some of the amendments were crazy. But it was all about procedural conversation. The same time this week, we get the throne speech passed, and I'm told it's without a vote, which is all, I guess all the procedural nerds, Kathleen, will understand that. But it's been crazy.
Well, I think I mean, there was no recorded vote, but Tim, didn't you read that as the speaker he asked whether there was going to be a division. There was no dissent, and so it just passed. So it passed with tacit approval of the House. It's not that the speaker just deemed it to have been passed. There was a call for a vote in the House. Nobody called for a division, and so it passed. My guess is that there were probably some people away. Who knows? But it's perfectly legitimate. You don't have to have a standing vote or a recorded vote on every single motion, and so it was completely within the rules as I understood it. I mean, people seem to be making a very big deal about it, but there are lots of bills that pass in that way and motions that pass in that way in the House of Commons and in legislature.
But a confidence vote?
Well, yes, okay, fair enough. Unusual, yeah. But I think we're going to see a lot of that because there's obviously reluctance on the part of all the parties to support the Liberals, but there's more reluctance to have an election. So it's a relative thing.
I think the opposition parties made their point in getting the amendment in that it would have to include a budget being introduced. I think that they made their point. They won that vote, the opposition parties. Right. The Liberals lost that vote. The Prime Minister happened to be out of the city at the time, out of the province. But in any event, I think that was the key point. And then to Kathleen's point, they didn't want to be seen to vote for it. No one wants an election. So just no division, just no vote. Basically, it's deemed to be been accepted. So I think that, as I say, they made their point on getting the amendment in about the budget. But I think that I can't see how that's binding on the government. The government can't be forced to bring in a budget, I don't believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, John, the headline that struck me before the vote on the throne speech was the NDP is going to vote against it. Well, they really didn't. And I go back to my question, what exactly does the NDP mean federally anymore? And we posed the question, how new can you be 50 years later? But anyway, the point being, they are in a place where they can shout all they want. But I think Tim made the point on the radio this morning. They didn't have the balls to actually stand up and vote against it. Kind of live by their commitment.
Well, and none of those parties wanted to trigger another election. Well, okay, so let's be clear. And who knows whether there was something offered behind the scenes? I certainly don't to the NDP. But it's clear that the government House leaders had to have had a meeting so that they would have been able to pass the way it did. So there were discussions that took place. I think there's two things I want to raise, though, and that is that the Carney impetus to get things done. And yes, they're not talking about the steel tariffs at the moment because it could be possible that there is some deal in the works that may come ahead of the G7. I mean, that's what's rumored. That's what we hear. And it may be substantive because the government didn't retaliate immediately. So there's that. But also, I have to step back and say, look, I think most people are really concerned just about the economy. I mean, all these things about Bill 5 and votes in the House are all really interesting procedural issues. But when I look at the Bank of Canada report that came out this week, which effectively said we're at a bit of a tipping point here because we don't know the full impact that's going to happen because on the economy, because there was stockpiling that went on by Americans who shipped stuff south of the border. So there was a GDP growth, but maybe that's going to stop. We have 6 of the banks that are now reporting significant profits, but they're now taking up loan loss provisions in a very significant way. In fact, we're looking at potential interest rate, issues that may harken back to 2010 to 2012. We've seen an uptick in a very substantial way about people missing credit card and loan payments. I think, there is the other issue here is just the whole anxiety about where are we going over the next quarter. So I think that's the bigger issue that we're all going to have to address. Part of this is about the tariffs, but the other part is you can't pivot the entire economy of this country. You can't pivot entire sectors and say, well, we're going to go and deal with Europe instead, or we're going to, make steel here and stockpile it so we can sell it in other parts of the world without a pretty significant runway and without a pretty significant investment. So I actually think the bigger issue for the third quarter is all about the economy, to find out what the impact is going to be, to see where the Bank of Canada ends up in September, take a look at the housing market and the credit provisions that we have. I think that's where people's heads are at the moment, as opposed to, the things that we're talking about are important, but not like that wave, which I think people are worried about the most.
Tim, last week we had the comms and strategy team on Now and Next, and I think the most poignant comment came from Anne-Marie Aikens, formerly at Metrolinx, and she talked about Mark Carney. She said, the only thing that's higher than Mark Carney's approval rating right now are our expectations of him. And I think, yep, you're bang on. And sort of to John's point around all of these things are going to have to fit into that vessel of our expectations around the Prime Minister and his new government. Against that backdrop, Carney meets with the First Ministers this week out in, Saskatchewan. By all accounts, that was viewed as a master stroke of brilliance politically, and way to go, heading out there to meet them on their turf in the West, etc. But the expectations out of that meeting, I thought, were we're going to have some kind of grand plan. We're going to have something that we can hang our hat on and say, okay, to John's point, this is where we're going to go. This is how the economy is going to be shaped. We got none of that. We're going to move forward now and come up with the list of grand infrastructure. 1, 2, I didn't hear a whole lot of conversation about the Canada Day deadline to deal with interprovincial trade barriers. So those two things to me seem to be kind of muted. Now, maybe I've misread that, but we're back to that expectation game, and there's a short runway in there for him to deliver.
Yeah, look, I won't give him a perfect score, I guess, but I think a very good score. Like what it was. I guess you campaign in poetry, right, and govern in prose. So the notion that you can have all of that done by July 1 was probably building expectations up too high. But directionally, I'm impressed, and he seems to really have set a good tone of cooperation with the premiers. I was in the premier's office here in Ontario. He spoke very warmly about his discussions with Carney and has faith that he's going to deliver and work well with the premiers. Look, what was most refreshing here is there is a return to seriousness. There's a thoughtfulness in decisions. There seems to be a consistency so far out of the gate, and I think that is welcomed by Canadians when we let some serious issues, really drift. And the pattern of votes in terms of getting rid of the consumer side of the carbon tax, not proceeding with the increase in capital gains tax, and a border bill, which sounds almost more on the conservative side than liberal. I can't imagine the Trudeau government doing any of those three things, and these are much more serious and wanted, needed approaches.
The border bill scares me a little bit, Kathleen, just in terms of some of the things that are being kicked around in there, in terms of agencies having access to digital information that I might have otherwise. Canada Post opening mail. Okay. I get we want to get at the organized crime issues. I get that there's an underlying concern here, but whoa.
So it may be a bit of an overcorrection. I'm not sure Canada Post is going to pose a threat to anyone in the immediate future, but I think that to Tim's point, I think this government is doing the things that they believe they need to do. I think the most important thing that we're seeing right now is that Prime Minister Carney has not reacted to Donald Trump's latest move on tariffs, because I think, as John has said, I think that there is something going on in terms of a deal. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but it seems like there may be the possibility of a deal. And I think that the point of the First Minister's meeting was really the relationships. I was a bit surprised actually at the language around, I think Santa Claus was what Doug was talking about. I was like, I don't know. Boy. I'm not sure. I think there might be disappointment on Christmas morning. But what that spoke to was that there was a good conversation. There wasn't a divided group of premiers coming out of that meeting, and you could kind of tell going in that they were in a good mood. So a lot of the work had been done ahead of time. So I think that the Prime Minister has done well for this start. I think they've moved to having, I think they said legislation by July 1st now. So I don't know exactly what that will look like, but building those relationships, trying to bring everyone into the to the table and having people at least somewhat on the same page in terms of the ability to work together. That was his job number one in terms of the relationships in the country. And I think he's done it.
Well, Keith, speaking of relationship, Premier Smith has invited the Prime Minister to attend the Oilers game 5 against the Panthers, assuming it goes 5. But
are they going to need 5?
Well, I don't know. They needed 4 periods last night, so that we'll deal with that. But the question though around this collegiality and that list that's going to come out. The funny thing to me is that I wondered whether or not Doug Ford was going to slip Metrolinx in the crosstown onto his list of things he had done with the feds. But that list is important. And I think the tell around what Kathleen has pointed to and John alluded to, this idea that we may have a trade deal before the G7. It's not so much that the Prime Minister didn't react. Doug Ford explicitly said, if you put the tariffs on steel and aluminum, I'm going to pull the plug again on the energy. And he has kept his hands off of that. He actually backed off the language considerably when pushed on it by the press gal. I think that's a bigger tell.
Absolutely. Because Doug Ford, he wants dollar for dollar tariff matching. He wants us to reshore all our steel manufacturing, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, not on not going to put the tariff on the electricity exports to the 3 states. Just not going to do it because, again, there's something in the works. And I think that's what the Prime Minister is alluding to here. And I still think that July 1st is a date where people expect to see something, whether it's legislation or a deal before the G7 in Kananaskis or whatever. People are very, very hopeful that something's coming. I think back to the First Minister's meeting itself. I mean, I can't imagine a Prime Minister coming out with better reviews from a group of premiers, from a sit-down First Minister's meeting. Not only did Premier Ford call him Santa Claus, I mean, Premier Holt continued the analogy and saying, and on Christmas morning, the kids won't be fighting over what each other got. In other words, the provinces are going to be willing to make deals here, and some are going to, get a little more than others. It's really interesting to see that. But as well, Dave, you mentioned Premier Smith inviting him to the Oilers game. That's exactly the kind of thing. Both Smith and Moe said that, Carney has already done more to address Western alienation than Justin Trudeau did in the previous 10 years. So this is all just exactly the right signals that we need to see. Everyone wants to get the economy on the same track. Can it be done by July 1st? Can they get this, one economy from 13? That seems a bit ambitious, but I think they can strike some major deals to get a lot of goods flowing and labor mobility, all these sorts of things. It may not be what everyone is hoping for. The expectations have been raised very high, but the work is being done, and the level of cooperation that we're seeing. I mean, as I say, both Premiers Moe and Smith coming out of that meeting and being pleased with what Carney is saying. That's a huge change from what we've seen in the last decade.
Yeah, I guess small victories, John.
Yeah, but I have to say a couple of things. First of all, I remember when Justin Trudeau had his first meeting with the premiers, and it went much the same way. I mean, Harper hadn't been meeting with the premiers.
Right.
Jim Flaherty was mailing in the increase in terms of healthcare. Justin Trudeau in 2015 heralded a new cooperation with the provinces, and everybody was kind of at the table. So I think there's the hubris of the beginning of the regime, and we've yet to sort of see where the rubber meets the road. The second thing is that there are expectations to be managed right now. The public is 8 percentage points ahead in terms of finding Mark Carney to be their best choice for Prime Minister than voted for him. So he's clearly got, the movement of the public and many who didn't vote for him behind him. The real issue is how somebody can manage the expectations within their own government on delivering on all of these things. I mean, I think it's great if you effectively come to the podium and say, look, we're going to increase our spending on defense to 2.5%, take it to 3.5%. We're going to invest, 30 to $40 billion on top of where we are today and bring us up to snuff in the arms agreements or the ammunition agreements that are available in Europe. And we're going to be involved in all. You got to stop and kind of go, okay, but you've now just put the yardstick out. Where's the 30 billion coming from? Does that come from other places? Does it come from increased taxes? Like you say, things have to happen. And I think part of this may have happened when you go into a meeting with the premiers kind of saying that you were going to come out with a list of projects to be done. And it doesn't happen. What you do get are the talking points from the throne speech that say, or the mandate letter saying, this is what we're going to work on. So I think, we do have a situation where not all the staff are in place federally. I mean, chiefs of staff are still being named. Staffs are being put together. We still have half a cabinet that has not held a portfolio before. We still have a prime minister who's used to a certain style and making corporations and others react and may have to deal with a bureaucracy that decides it wants to put sand in the gears. I think it's part of not just managing the public expectations, but it's also managing their own expectations in terms of what you can say you're going to do and what you can deliver on. Because I think we're getting the federal government is getting a little ahead of itself, and it's going to learn that there's stakeholders and others within even its own government that are going to have to be considered before you can, for sure say that you are going to move forward on a number of different files.
But John, I was at that meeting in 2015. I was a premier in Ontario when Trudeau came into office, and I can tell you, we did not come out, to Keith's point that, striking the tone that is necessary. We did not come out of that meeting in 2015 very happy, because the big issue then, if you remember, was the health, it was health funding,
right,
as it often is, right? That's kind of the default in terms of First Ministers meetings. But we were making the argument about being at, 20 to 23% of federal contribution. We wanted it to move up to 30, and we didn't get the movement that we wanted. So, there were premiers going to the mic and saying different things coming out of that meeting. And it was a different moment in terms of obviously our relationship to other countries, particularly the United States. But I would just say we didn't feel as happy as the premiers seemed to feel coming out of this First Ministers meeting. Whether you're right, whether the feds can live up to the expectations, probably not, except that the goodwill has been established. And I think that was job number one, because without that, it was going to be even more difficult. It's going to be difficult doing the things that the federal government is saying they need to do. This whole environment is politically treacherous. What is the unemployment rate in Windsor is 11% or something right now. Like, we're in the midst of challenges and problems because of the uncertainty in the United States already. It's not like we're waiting for it to start. So it's all challenging. But if he hadn't come out of that meeting with goodwill, how much more difficult would it be?
Yeah, Tim, we started this conversation vis-a-vis Bill 5 and the possibility of it being a long, hot, difficult summer for the Ford government. To Kathleen's point, there are Sault Ste. Marie, all Hamilton, in terms of the steel industry, those places are feeling the effects right now in terms of jobs and the effects on jobs. Crystal ball it for us. I mean, between now and the time the legislature gets back in business after Labor Day, does that become more of a sore spot in terms of what we're going to have to deal with on the front burner vis-a-vis, if we get a deal, that's one thing, but I'm not sure that repairs the damage done immediately in those markets.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I remain an optimist on this. I have been from the get-go. My philosophy is, Trump may be crazy, but he's not nuts. He
are you sure?
You're attributing subtlety to Trump.
And what's the distinction?
By that, but he's got a political reality he has to deal with, right? He's got to keep the Freedom Caucus very narrow margin. In the House, he'll have pressure from those that depend on trade, which I think over time tempers the madness, so it's not completely nuts. So that's, it's been one of my underlying assumptions on, why I do think a deal will be reached. some of my colleagues spoke about it earlier on, just the way that the tenor has relaxed a little bit in our discussions tells me that probably an advanced stage, and I hope to get inside the tariff wall. There will be a tariff wall. I hope to get inside of it. All that having been said, there will be tariffs, and we may be subject to, a minimum level on aluminum and steel. The UK would have that kind of deal, for example. So what do you do? What do you do there? Well, I think in the meantime, you can find sort of life preservers to keep jobs afloat, support that sector. I don't think the adjustment will be nearly as bad as we fear, but I think there will be some adjustment in those two particular sectors.
All right. Well, lots on the table, and we'll keep an eye on things as we get closer to the G7, because I think the tone of that conversation is going to tell us a whole lot. And if we get a deal between now and then,
how long can we wait with 50% steel tariffs? I mean,
that's right. I agreed. Yeah.
I'm a former proud member of Steelworkers Local 1005 in Hamilton. Let me assure you, this is rocking Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie. 50% is just, everyone knows that's not sustainable for any industry in this country to deal with that. So I think it's quite shocking that Trump, he may be crazy or nuts or both, but to jump it up to 50% because he struck a deal with Japan to invest $2 billion into the U.S. steel industry. I'm sure he could have struck a deal without. Anyway, it all just seems a needless ramping up. And of course, the only solace that you can take from it is that it's against the entire world's imports of steel to the United States, not just Canada. There's not much solace to take it, as I say, 50% tariffs. Unless that's dealt with and there's a deal very, very quickly, that's going to have some major impact in Hamilton and the Sioux in particular, very quickly.
Well, both mayors were out this morning, I think, Keith, saying this is a disaster. Like they're not waiting to say it's going to be a disaster. Andrea was saying already that Andrea Horvath, this is a disaster for Hamilton.
Just to my crazy versus nuts category, though, Canada, the largest source of imports to the States in both steel and aluminum, just don't have the capacity. Prices will be driven up on their manufactured goods. So the pattern with Trump that's just so frustrating is he'll go to an extreme and then sort of reality hits and he backs off. So I hope I'm right about this one. That similarly, I think you'll see a tempering there, at least when it comes to Canada. I just think the economic reality is going to dictate that.
I also would say that, Mark Carney, in terms of the first part of him taking power, has created a great new feeling of moving forward and that he's in control and that he can make the deals that happen for Canada. He's got all the pieces there, including when he met with the premiers and he's come out of them. There are all the right feelings about Mark Carney right now. I think watching him over the last couple of days, it may also signal, including the steel threat that Trump has leveled, that there is a deal in the making, that you can see pieces, whether it's the steel tariff suddenly coming onto the fore, or whether it's the security legislation, which is being brought forward by Canada, or whether it's a certain responsiveness that the federal government has. You can see that there are different blocks and pieces coming together, and that you do hope that it is substantive for a deal. But all of these things I don't think can be taken individually. They have to be taken in concert. And given how he's reacted and given how some of the legislation has moved forward and some of the ideas, I think there's more substance there than smoke, that there may be a deal that's moving forward.
So at the risk of really damaging the taco industry and, Trump always chickens out, I want to change it to Trump urgently reverses direction.
Oh boy, I got it.
Oh, really?
Why don't we just that kind of fits all around, right?
I worry about the taco thing because it's like a taunt to a bully, right?
True.
It annoys you.
We dare you not to chicken out. It's just like everybody just shut up and let him revert to form, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. On that note, we'll leave it right there. Kathleen Wynne, Keith Leslie, Tim Hudak, John Wright. Thank you all for being here this week. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Just one of the points that John was talking about in terms of where the priorities are going to be decided, where he's going to, and he alluded to, Ben's exam, had a really insightful conversation with Scott Clancy last week on Now and Next. You might want to dip into that because the former Major General the retired Major General, RCAF, has real deep insights into how that money gets spent, where it gets allocated, and who controls it. So what kind of decisions would be made. And he's not all that optimistic that the federal government, doesn't matter what party was in power, was going to be able to hit that 2% of GDP by 2030. So just dip into that now and next. You can find it in this feed on the YouTube channel. Otherwise, you can listen to it wherever you're listening to this podcast, on Apple, Spotify, or iHeart. If you're on YouTube right now, subscribe to the channel and you'll get the notifications, and everything drops into your inbox as we post it. All right, that'll do it for us. It is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
I have a YouTube channel right here, as you can all people see. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content. Look at this. Bye now.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.